Good. Chapter 5, about formulating the research design as such. Let us start by seeing where we are in our process. And right now, we are using this one. We have the questions, objectives, philosophies, theory, approach, and methodology and strategy is our focus at this particular lecture. So this is what we will be focusing at. And remembering that philosophy was about the paradigms and theory approach was about being inductive or deductive or abductive. So now we will take a step further and start understanding what does methodology mean and what is hiding behind the word strategy. And in this case, it simply means strategies for how to collect data. Now, we have our 4 purposes, and it's always good to have these in mind. You have seen them several times now, but also it makes a lot of sense just to remember that we have these different kinds of purposes about being descriptive, exploratory, explanatory, and evaluative. Good. Now, let's look at types of data. There are different ways of talking about data, but I'm going to talk about data in terms that everybody agrees that this is how we understand this type of data. Now, first of all, we can divide data into primary data and secondary data. And primary data, these are data collected for the purpose of the ongoing research. Simply means if we have a project of investigating the satisfaction of employees, then we might do a little survey, or we might interview some people in the company, and we are interviewing them with the intention of using those responses or narratives that they supply us with in order to talk about satisfaction in the company, and therefore these data support the purpose of our research. So we are collecting data that is having the purpose of supporting our research. Whereas secondary data, data collected for another purpose. If we keep having the example of satisfying or satisfied employees at our company, then would there be any secondary data? Well, there might be an industry. There might be a case where our company is part of an industry. And within the industry, there might have been some research performed about how satisfied are employees within the industry. So we could actually collect that kind of data. They are not specifically with the intention of understanding the satisfaction of our employees, but they might give us ideas about how to understand our own data afterwards. So primary collected for the purpose of the ongoing research, our research. That means when you do a project, when you are collecting data that has not been collected before, and you collect them because you need to in order to answer some of your research questions, or you collect them in order to understand something about your research objectives, then this is primary data. Then primary data can be divided into internal data, which is found inside the organization, and it can be external data. Let's try to move on to the next slide here, because when we then put it in this way, we can have primary data up here, secondary down here, and then we put the other dimension on, which is internal and external. So that creates 4 quadrants here. And if we look at this first quadrant being secondary, that is data collected for another purpose, and internal, that means something that characterizes data that's internal and secondary. That could be numbers from our accounting department. It could be sales numbers. It could be production numbers, etc. So here we do find lots of data that we have in the company, and someone else has already collected that particular data, and we can simply just pick it up. Now, what about the other quadrants here? Well, if we look at secondary data and external, I have already mentioned industry reports as one example. Or it could be, if you're doing a competitor analysis, it could be the profit and loss statements from your competitors. It could be statistical bureaus like the Danish Statistical Bureau. It could be Eurostat. There are lots of different both databases and companies who have already collected lots of different data. So that would be external to us and secondary. So someone else in our external environment has collected this kind of data. So all of this down here is about secondary, and you could say all of this is external. Now, if we look at primary data, that's, as we remember, data that's collected for the purpose of the ongoing research. If we would like to investigate something about satisfaction of our employees, and we are asking them, for example, questions about how motivated are you? And how satisfied are you? Do you like the food in the canteen? What do you think about the work environment in, etc., etc.? Then this would be data that we collect inside the organization, and we collect it with the purpose here of investigating satisfaction. So this quadrant is about collecting primary data inside the organization. And in the same way as indicated before, we can collect primary data from our external environment. That could be customers, for example, could be about competitors, etc. So if we want to collect primary data about customers, then we might want to collect data about their buying behavior. And we would then have to investigate that. We could do a survey, we could do personal interviews, etc. And if we want to collect primary data for, that means for our purpose, about competitors, we would probably have to make, or we could make observations about what do competitors do, but it would be something that is primary regarding our purpose and something that nobody else has already collected. So this kind of defines 4 different kinds of data that we will be facing. And it's important to remember that when we have a project, that we kind of go through these 4 quadrants to say, in order to solve our project and honor the research question and find the correct data for our research objectives, in order to make the analysis and discuss and come up with the evaluations, are there then any primary data that we need to collect, either internally or externally? And we also need to consider, are there any secondary data that we need to collect, either internally or externally? And the good thing about secondary data is that it's often quite cheap compared to collecting primary data. And since it's already collected by someone else, it's faster to get hold on. So if you can get good ideas about how to move on by evaluating secondary data, that means that you should always consider secondary data first in order to get more knowledge about the situation that you find yourself in. So let's try to look at another aspect of data, namely the division of data into quantitative and qualitative data. Now, quantitative data is about numbers and about handling and evaluating these numbers using different kinds of statistical tools. And qualitative data is about words. It's about talking to people. It's about what they say. It's about what they have been written. It's about their opinions. So that way, we have, you could say, hardcore data up here, quantitative, and we have qualitative data as well, indicating opinions from people. Let's try now to look at what characterizes these two different kinds of research approaches. And as you can see up here, we have quantitative, and we will be looking at quantitative to the left, and we will be looking at the qualitative for the right. So looking at a quantitative research, there we will find that, as you can see here, this is the idea of a researcher. The researcher is outside the system. So this little circle here illustrates the system that we might research. It could be a case, it could be anything, but it's described by the system that we are researching. And when we are doing quantitative research, the researcher is generally seen as independent from those being researched. And if we look at the qualitative research process, here you can see that the researcher is kind of part of the system that the researcher is investigating. And of course, we can all see that over here, this clearly points to positivism, and this clearly points to interpretivism. So we have these ideas about where do we find good research tactics. So if we had chosen a positivistic approach, we would probably also, just by looking at this, find ourselves in a position where we will say, well, we would probably need some quantitative research and we would like to be aside the system. Whereas if we have a more interpretive paradigm, then we will say it's okay that our values count, it's okay that we are part of it, and we will probably go for more qualitative research design. And if we are in a quantitative position, then we normally would call our people who we ask questions, we would call them respondents. And when we have a qualitative approach, we call them participants. So going for a more quantitative research, this is normally designed to examine relationships between variables, like the one that we have here, that we have some kind of idea about y equals x1 plus b2 plus something. So we have this kind of relationship between variables, and therefore we would like to stay out of the equation ourselves and not influence the equation, but try to be very objective. On the other hand, over here, when we are talking about qualitative research, very often we are designing a research in order to figure out what are people's attributed meanings or attitudes towards something, what are their relationships, etc. And therefore, when we design it, it's very much about asking people questions where we would get answers like, I like this because, or I believe in, etc. So quite a different approach. And because just like we might find connections here between some of the variables, we may also over here find connections between, for example, if a lot of people say that I believe in, and then another thing saying that it also points in a direction that they are motivated by this and this. So there might be a connection, but we are not really trying to investigate it from the start. It might be something that simply just pops up when we are doing the investigation. So it's a more inductive approach. And then how do we then sample? And in the quantitative research, we will use the statistical approaches with population, target population, and sample. And we are discussing later today sampling techniques. And in the qualitative research, we are normally using non-probability sampling techniques. Then the specific methods that we would be using in quantitative research would over here be, for example, questionnaires. That's something that is rigorously defined and highly structured. And that is certainly something that questionnaires are. And we would probably also do experiments, maybe using questionnaires as well in the experiment. Whereas the methods used in qualitative research is more unstructured and semi-structured. For example, a depth interview or a focus group interview. So also the methods are quite different in these two research approaches. And then the collection of those more over here in the quantitative research, the data will be organized in, let's say, spreadsheets or something, in some way where we can standardize so that we can later on do our statistical analysis. Whereas the collection here on the qualitative research is more like not just blah, blah, but also it's about people talking. It's about them, maybe they are drawing something, and then only afterwards we might see that lots of people have mentioned the same word, they have talked about the same artifact, for example, within a company, and that might be something that we need to look into in our analysis. Then analysis conducted is about using statistics and diagrams like mentioned before. And over here for the qualitative research, the analysis is very much about conceptualization, means trying to find patterns in what we see. So if you decide to investigate employee satisfaction or motivation, and you're doing 20 interviews, then you might find that 15 of those guys there, they are all mentioning a specific leader or a specific manager or a specific artifact that has a meaning to them, or that might actually make them feel good, feel bad, and you didn't knew that before. So then you can start to conceptualize about specific management or specific artifacts that will support people being satisfied. But you cannot really count it. You cannot use numbers to investigate it. You have to conceptualize it. So that means that over here, our resulting meaning comes from numbers, and resulting meaning over here from in the qualitative research comes from words and images. But we still have meaning. We still have a result. We still have a conclusion in both cases. And therefore, it's also over it. The qualitative is based on meanings expressed through words, spoken, textual, could be videos, etc. So this is what characterizes qualitative research and quantitative research. And let's try to put them up here and say then, how can we then explain a little bit more about first quantitative data? What characterizes those? Well, it's about primary and secondary data. that has or can be quantified. So it's a question about, is it possible for us to quantify the data? Do we find it appropriate to have a number describing a specific thing that we are investigating? Satisfaction, for example. Could we ask a question? How satisfied are you from a scale, in a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is very satisfied, etc. And then you're describing what the number stands for. And then people can simply check the box. In that way, you get a number for that particular attitude towards satisfaction. That means that we are converting primary data to a quantifiable number that expresses an opinion from a person. So if that's possible, we can also use our statistics afterwards, but we need to be careful what kind of statistics we are using, but we'll get back to that at a later lecture. So that's something that characterizes quantitative data. What about the qualitative data over here? Well, we have 3 different kinds: verbal, textual, and visual. And if you want to investigate the same thing about satisfaction from employees, you could simply ask people to talk about it. What do you think? How do you find it on an overall basis to be here? Are you satisfied? Something that makes you happy? Something that you are not interested in, or something? So you might actually record it, or you might ask people to write things down. Or you might actually ask people to make a drawing of if you could express your satisfaction in a drawing, how would you do it? Well, it's probably not the best way to do it if you have to do, or if you're dealing with participants in the research who are grown-ups, because then it might not be fit. It might not be the best possible way of investigating it, because they might find it ridiculous. So it's also about choosing the right specific way of asking for data from your respondents. So that leaves us with some choices. And as illustrated in the book, when we are talking about those methodological choices, we can simply go for quantitative research designs, we can go for qualitative research designs, or mixed method. And it's no surprise that the mixed methods research designs are a combination of quantitative research designs and qualitative research designs. So that's something that we simply just mix. And therefore, when we are mixing it, it also means that it has the characteristics that we have just been going through. So when we choose, as it says here at the bottom, we choose based upon how it supports our research question, our research objectives, and the purpose. So if we have a research question, which is very much about counting how many people like Lego, the company in Denmark, then would it make a lot of sense trying to do quantitative research, mono method, saying that we simply do a survey and ask an appropriate number of people, and then we get the proportion in the Danish population who actually like Lego? Would that fulfill our task? And we say, yeah, it does. Okay. So what about qualitative research design? Would it make sense to use a qualitative approach in order to figure out the proportion of people in Denmark who like Lego? And probably not. And also because now we know what it means to have a qualitative approach. So it wouldn't make a lot of sense doing that. And what about a mixed method? Well, it depends. If, for example, the research question was how many people like the Lego and why, if we add and why, then it might make a lot of sense to use a mixed method research design, simply because we will start out by doing our quantitative research and figuring out the proportion that likes, and then we would also ask those people who said, yes, we like LEGO. We would go into depth with some of them and explain, or not explain, but have them explain to us, why is it that you like LEGO? And of course, the good researcher would also ask some of those people who said no, and ask those people, why don't you like LEGO? Because then LEGO will get ideas about what can they change in order to have more people liking them. So therefore, the research question, the research objective, and the purpose of our research certainly has a great impact on what kind of methodological choice do we make. And it also comes with the direction from the paradigm that we have been choosing as well. So looking into mixed methods, we can have, when we have a mixed method, we can have different kinds of approaches, but you can basically mix it as you please. But we call it concurrent when we do both quantitative and qualitative methods at the same time. And we call it sequential exploratory if we start with qualitative methods and then move on to quantitative methods. Now, an example of a sequential exploratory research would be satisfaction in our company. We might want to start by understanding what defines in people the way they understand satisfaction. So we might do some depth interviews and ask some of the employees, how do you feel about working here? And we might use some theories as well, but we're basically talking to people, collecting qualitative data. And then based on the qualitative data, we might find that there are 4 or 5 things that people say over and over again, having a great impact on their satisfaction. And then we can decide to test that. And therefore, we set up a survey afterwards and then collect quantitative data and during the survey, and then we might even have a confirmation of our hypothesis that this is actually something that creates satisfaction. That's one example. Another example, sequential explanatory. We might start out by having a quantitative method. For example, lots of companies do investigate the satisfaction of their employees, and they have different parameters that they are working on and measuring, so different variables. And one of the variables might be a specific thing about the working hours. And then it might turn out that lots of employees says, no, I don't like the working hours. And then you simply say, okay, how is that? And then you simply try to design afterwards a qualitative research to figure out why is it that some people do not like the working hours. That means to get in depth with some of the problems that we identified based on our quantitative research. And of course, the last one, sequential, multi-phase, qualitative, then quantitative, then qualitative. It might also be quantitative, then qualitative, and then quantitative. Same thing. But again, it's about choosing based on our research question, our research objective, and our purpose. So what are the strategies for collecting data? And in this lecture, we will take a closer look at these different types of strategies that we can see here to the left. We have experiment and survey, which are more or less linked to quantitative research designs. And that's simply because they normally create numbers in some way, and that means that we can actually calculate and use statistics on them. Then we have another group of strategies, archival and documentary and case study. They are kind of involved with both quantitative and qualitative, because it can be both. Then the last group will be ethnography, action research, grounded theory, and narrative inquiry. And these four belonging to this group is mostly found when we do qualitative research. And therefore, again, just pointing out, we have to choose based upon our research question, objective, and the purpose, and the specific data that we need. If we, for example, know that we need to have a specific idea about what is the proportion of the Danish population who like Lego, then it doesn't matter that we are using action research or maybe a case study. We need to do maybe, or certainly a survey, maybe even we need to do an experiment. And if we want to, on the other hand, have specific data about how do people understand the management style here and what is it that would lead people to be more satisfied, then it's for certain that we could start with a survey, but it would also be quite obvious that we would probably have to do some case study in our company, and maybe combined with surveys. And then afterwards, we might actually throw in some action research. And action research is where we are actually creating changes as we go along in the investigation of the specific issues of the research question. Good. So you have seen this overview before in another lecture, but I find it appropriate to have it here again. Now divided into primarily quantitative strategies, experiment and survey, and here archival, documentary and case studies, both quantitative and qualitative, and primarily qualitative would be connected with action research, grounded theory, ethnographic and narrative research. So, taking a closer look at the research strategy. First, let's take a closer look at experiments. What is an experiment? And an experiment is basically what the word says. We are experimenting with something. So it means that if you do an experiment, you could say, what happens if I mix a drink with water, lemon, and vodka? And then you might say, oh, I'll make another experiment. What happens if I mix a drink with water, lemon, and rum? So these are experiments, and you are having something that you are changing. And the point here is that when we experiment, we need to have a starting point, and we need to have something that we call a dependent variable. Means that, as you can see here, the dependent variable that may change in response to changes in other variables. So the dependent variable is quite important. It could again be satisfaction in our company and satisfaction amongst employees. So that could be what we call the dependent variable. That means it's the variable that will change if we experiment with something that might affect the satisfaction. Quite simple. We have a measurement of satisfaction. It might turn out that on a scale from 1 to 5, people have a degree of satisfaction of 3.2. Then we do an experiment, and we are throwing in free lunch for everybody. And then we are measuring satisfaction again after 2 months. And now the measurement shows that the dependent variable, that means satisfaction, has now risen from 3.2 to 3.5. So does that mean that our experiment with throwing in lunch, did that work? And we could say, yeah, it did. Or, well, it might not be significant, but we actually have a change. So the idea about experimenting is to control the experiment and figuring out when we have something that is dependent on something else, then how can we work with that? And then we need to remember that the mediating variable might be something that comes in between and explain things. So we have moderators and we have control variables and confounding variables. I would rather go to, this is, you can just go in and check up on it, but I would rather that we try to take a closer look at how do we design this. Because when we are designing an experiment, and that's the right word, we need to design an experiment. We need a control group and we need an experimental group. So if we just look at the control group up here and notice that we have time equals 0, could be today, and time plus 1, that could be in 2 months. Now the control group, we are assigning members to the control group randomly. That's what it says here. And then we have a measurement of the dependent variable. That could be satisfaction. And notice that when we have the control group and the experimental group, both groups are assigned members on a random basis. Both groups have measured their satisfaction at time t0. So at this point, you could say they are equal. And then down here at the experimental group, between time 0 and time 1, we have an intervention, or we manipulate with the independent variable. And that means we are manipulating by introducing free lunch for everybody in the experimental group. The control group will not have free lunches. And we would probably have to do it at 2 different locations in order to figure out what it is. Because if the same people in the same department, some will get free lunch and others won't, that probably won't be the best way to investigate it. So they don't need to know what it is. But as you can see, we are measuring the control group, we are measuring the experimental group, then we introduce free lunch in the experimental group, and then we are measuring again at this point of time. And that means that we can now figure out if the experimental group have actually improved their satisfaction. But what if the control group has also improved their satisfaction with the same amount? Then it might not be this lunch that has made the difference. Or there might be other explanations. But that is why it's important to have a control group, so we can make sure that we have indications of our experiment is actually working. Good. Let's try to look at different kinds of experimental designs. And this is not something that's in the book. It's a step deeper into doing experimental designs. And also it's a pretty simple way to understand how to do experimental designs. And if we look at the first one, only after, and we note that we have X, and X is the experiment. That could be free lunch. We have O, that's the measurement, the observation. And then R is about assigning members to the groups at a random basis. So as you can see here, we have one specific experimental design, which is called only after. So we do the experiment and then we measure. But of course, there are lots of problems with that, because we have no idea whether the experiment has actually caused any changes in this. Then let's try to look at another example, before and after. So O1 is observation 1. That means we are measuring people's satisfaction at the 1st of January. Then we throw in free lunch, and we are measuring people's satisfaction at the 1st of February or 1st of March or some other point of time. And if we are using a scale where people are indicating from 1 to 5 how satisfied they are, then we can calculate an average of O1, we can calculate an average of O2, and that means we can calculate the effect of the experiment by simply saying O2 minus O1. The problem here is that we have asked one group, as you can see here, it's the same group we are asking. We are asking at the 1st of January, and by simply asking, we are creating attention towards satisfaction, lots of things that goes with satisfaction. So that means that people might start to be more alert to things that keep them satisfied. And therefore, by simply asking before we do our experiment, might bring the experiment in danger, and we may not be able to trust this effect. That is why often we do some kind of comparison, and that is why we are throwing in these experiment groups and control groups and talking about this. So if we look at the only after problems, we can't really say anything. If we go down to static group comparison, we have the same thing. We do the experiment and then we measure. But we also have a control group that we, of course, have calculated or have an opinion about, are basically comparable to group number 1. And if we can have a change here, then we might be able to talk about a specific effect. But there are also problems with that one. Now, looking at something else up here, the before-after with control group. This is more like the one that is shown in your book, because here we are randomly assigning members to the experiment group and to the control group. Then at the control group, we are measuring, and then we are measuring again at a later point of time. And we do that with the experiment group. We do the experiment, measure again, and now we have 4 measures. So in order to figure out whether we actually have an effect of our experiment, we can calculate the direct effect by saying O2 minus O1. But if something has happened in the environment that might affect all people within this particular setting, then the change would have happened anyway. And that is why we have this measure, because here we measure what happens without the experiment. So we can say we have to deduct, that is why we have a minus here. We have to deduct the effect from a control group not being exposed to the experiment. So that means the changes in the control groups, maybe satisfaction, will be 04 minus 03. And therefore, we have to deduct that. So the effect can be calculated using this equation. Then only after, with control group, again, we have randomly assigned, and we have experiment 01, 02, and we can calculate the effect. And then we have a separate sample before and after. So it simply means that we are measuring in sample 1, we do the experiment, and then we are measuring in sample 2. Now here we could actually use that in the same company, because we could choose, let's say we have 100 people in a department, and then we are simply asking 50 of them about how satisfied are you, and we keep track on who they are. And then we get a measure called 01. Then we do the experiment, we throw in free lunch, and we do it for all 100. And then after we have done the experiment, maybe a month or two after, we ask the other 50 employees the same questions, and they answer. And that becomes our 02 observation. So that means that we are kind of controlling the experiment, saying that the lunch would have this effect being 02 minus 01. Okay. And then we could have a discussion, and we will have that, but I've just put it in here, but we will go on for now, and then we'll get back to this experiment, or these experiments, and you will have an opportunity to discuss it later when I have finished the chapter here. Now, that was experiments, and often when we do experiments, they come with surveys, and surveys are very often simply understood by questionnaires, where we have designed different kinds of questions that we would like people to answer to. And of course, the questions are asking people to give answers in a form that we can use in order to make the analysis that we want to do according to our research. So if we want to investigate satisfaction, it doesn't matter that we are asking about what are the possibilities of you to get an extra loan in your house, for example, or something else. So we need to make sure that the data we ask for is asked for in the best possible way and without any bias. We'll get back to that one. So a questionnaire can be quantitative and qualitative. It means structured or unstructured. So when you send out a questionnaire, and that is why I've taken this types of questionnaires based on distribution, you can actually send it out by mail, snail mail, or with paper, an envelope, etc. Send it out to people, and they will send it back. It's one thing, not that common anymore. Then you can have in-house questionnaire. That is where the researcher is actually visiting people or standing next to them and asking the questions and then noting the questions down himself. Then we can have telephone questionnaires and other online questionnaires. There are lots of different possibilities for you to have and conduct research online. And we have lots of online tools that will help you set up questionnaires, and where you can simply just send it out with a link, and then people can get back to it, type in their answers, and you have the option to have it quantified at the same time. Makes it easier to process when you are going to do the analysis. Then it can also be unstructured, which is where you are using more qualitative questions. And you can have structured interviews, visiting people passing through, or people passing through in a mall or something. You can simply have interviews with them where you are structuring it, you are asking the questions, etc. And then it can also be both quantitative and qualitative. And then observation. You might simply imagine that you want to understand how people pick a specific product in a supermarket. And then you are simply standing in the supermarket, observing what do people do. And they might be going to a shelf where you have different kinds of products, and then you simply observe what they do. And you have a specific scheme where you are noting down what are they doing. So that would be structured observation, but is part of what we call a survey. Then archival and documentary research. Very important. As I mentioned in the start here, that we have down here the secondary data. As you may remember, I indicate that we always start by finding out, do we have any secondary data that we can find and use that can help us to understand what is this. And this is not only about finding data for a specific situation that might go into an analysis. It's also about visiting the library and getting lots of information about what has other people been writing about. Are there any articles? Are there any research, etc.? So that's pretty important. Then we have a case study. And as you remember, I talked about a case study earlier on. And according to Yin, this is the guy here, Yin, 2018, his work here. He's talking about having these two approaches for looking into a case. We have a single case design and multiple case design. So it's about defining whether we have only one case that we're looking at, or we might have more cases at the same time. And then he's dividing also into having a holistic view, means a single unit of analysis, or maybe a multiple units of analysis. So let's take an example. If we have a single unit of analysis and a single case, then we could illustrate it like this, that we have just one case, we have one thing that we are focusing on, we're delimiting ourselves, etc. But we may still have a single unit that might be satisfaction that we would like to focus at. But we might need to work with different cases. That could be different subsidiaries of our company, or it could be the case one here could be department one, department two, etc. And then down here, it could be multiple units of analysis. It could be satisfaction. It could also be work motivation. It could be lots of different things. So we simply have more units that we would like to do analysis for, not only satisfaction, but also competence level, etc., work environment. So if we focus on, let's say, a company, then we also focus, part of it is about the work environment, and another one is about motivation or satisfaction. Or it could be in different departments or in different companies that we own. Or it could also be, if it is you, like students, you might want to do one case analysis of one company. That would be company A. And then that company has no relation to another company, could be company B. But in your situation, in your study, they are simply representing two different cases where we have two units of analysis in both. And the same goes up here. So the thing here is, when you have a case and you have a project, it's, in most cases, it's a good idea to investigate, does it make sense to kind of define a case study? And then should it be a holistic single case, or maybe a holistic multiple case, or embedded multiple or embedded single case? Because that would help you to understand what is it that you need to do. And the simple understanding of you knowing that you have to look for two different kinds of units for analysis will help you understand specifically how to approach the data collection later on. Then we have the thing called ethnography, and I've tried to simply just write it's literally means a written account of people or an ethnic group, and as you may know, that it was basically developed because previously some cultures felt that other cultures than theirs were kind of primitive, and that's why they invented ethnography. Means that they would simply just meet with those guys, they would observe, describe, and then try to understand what is this. And it's very often used within culture. Then I have added this one, nethnography. That's related to the World Wide Web. So you can actually do nethnography, and that simply means that you can do the same thing. Means writing about the people or groups that you find on the internet. What kind of language do they use? What kind of things interest them, etc. And how do they speak together? Are there any specific narratives? Are there any specific discussions, etc.? So that can help understanding a specific group of people, and we could call that nethnography when we are dealing with it on the web. Then another strategy is about action research. Now, I try to illustrate it as simple as possible, because in the book it might become a little bit complicated, but it is basically these three cycles here. It's about, imagine that you are a manager and you are in a process where you are going to deal with a specific problem or a specific issue that you have in your department, the department you are managing. Then the first step is that you are simply trying to figure out, what is this about? Diagnosing. And it doesn't have to be a problem. It can simply be an area of improvement where you would like to do something. So you're diagnosing, what is it that I'll try to focus at? And then you plan for what you would like to do, and then you do it, and you evaluate what happened. And based on that first cycle here, you basically just create a new understanding of your employees and what is going on in your department. And that means that you are then, based on your first cycle, you are now much better prepared for diagnosing, for how to understand the customer and in this case the project, but it could be over here understanding people's satisfaction, understanding the structure of the supply chain, understanding how to use SOPs, etc. And then you are planning new action, you take action, you evaluate, and then you create new knowledge about people working with SOPs in dealing with the supply chain. And then you are diagnosing specifically what to do, and then means you are acting on the knowledge you have created. So if we go back, it simply means that a manager sets out to try something, and then being specific, following these steps here, being specific about how to do it, and then do it, and then based on the knowledge created and the new understanding, planning new action in order to correct or improve or make more efficient, etc., and then do it. And then you have created new knowledge about, okay, the way we can improve efficiency in this particular department is like this and this. And then they might go through a new set. So action research, Byron, is really much about you being part of the research. You are influencing the research directly, but it is a way of doing research, but it's not something that you will probably use. But if you do, you might get a chance in your internships where you're doing this. So if you are going to be part of something, then you might consider whether this action research spiral could be one way to approach it, or maybe to make a report about it in your internship report. Okay. Then grounded theory, basically about doing things and trying things out, and then simply develop a theory that is based upon the data that you create. So it simply means that you are collecting data and you are having a concurrent collection and analysis of data. You don't really know exactly what to collect, so you're collecting what you can, and then you're making the analysis of it, and then you start to develop codes of, okay, what might that be, and try to see if it can be analyzed in a specific way. You make sure that you write down memos for yourself, you write down what you have been doing. So you're documenting with the intention of, in the end, to be able to develop a theory that is grounded in these data. I would say it's not likely that you as BCM guys will be facing this kind of strategy, but now you know that it exists. So these were strategies. Now we need to turn to two terms, namely reliability and validity. Because when we do research and when we collect data and we design the process for collecting these data that we would like to use, we need to relate to reliability, which is, as it says here, can we rely on our design to achieve the same findings if someone else uses our design? It's the same thing as it says over here. I just try to shorten it down. And so that's about how we're doing things. And can somebody else, if they replicate what we have been doing, will they also find the same things that we did? So that means that it's reliable what we do. Then validity is about the accuracy of the analysis of the results. So it basically means, do we measure what we intend to measure? If we want to measure people's satisfaction, are we using the right wording? Are we using the right type of questions? Are we using the right kind of strategy, etc.? So these kind of questions are important. And then 2, is the analysis accurate? So as it says here, are the analysis of the results and the relationships being advanced accurate? So can we count on this particular analysis, and does it make sense to do it in that way? And 3rd, can the results be generalized? It simply means these results that we have, if we find something about satisfaction in one department and we make the analysis, we might have made an experiment, can that be implemented in another department and therefore come into effect? That means, can the results be generalized? So that is what reliability and validity is all about. And then, of course, there might be some issues regarding reliability and validity. It's something that makes those two not being that good. Let's try to see what that is. It's called threats to reliability. And please note that it's about positivist and quantitative approaches that these mostly apply. Now, when we have what we call participant error, as it says here, any factor which adversely alters the way in which a participant performs. So the participants, they can actually do things. When it says here, for example, asking a participant to complete a questionnaire just before lunch break may affect the way they respond compared to choosing a less sensitive time. So it's about the participant is not answering in the most appropriate way because that participant might be hungry. And right now we have lots of geopolitical issues as well. So if you ask questions or making surveys to people where they for 2 weeks ago wouldn't think about geopolitical issues, they might now, and therefore that general opinion might be altered simply because we have an incident that is taking up people's time. Then we have also participant bias, any factor which would induce a false response. So we also need to make sure that the participant will actually give a correct answer. And also, it doesn't mention here, but there's an extra thing is that we need to make sure that the participant actually know the answer. It's not enough that the participant will answer. It's also a question about whether the participant knows the answer and therefore can give a correct answer. Then we have a researcher error. Means about the researcher. For example, when a researcher may be tired and not sufficiently prepared. So lots of things can go wrong. You can ask questions in different ways. You can do lots of things. You can have the body language that might go in and have an effect. And then also, of course, the way the researcher here allow his or her own subjective use of disposition to get in the way of fairly accurate recording. So basically, it's about the researcher need to be very objective and treat every participant in the same way in order to avoid the bias. So that's something about threats for reliability. And some of the threats for validity. It's about past or recent events. Again, you could say geopolitical issues as well. It's about testing, instrumentation, mortality, whether you actually have people who are still part of the research or will they drop out? Do we have the right amount of people? Maturation, and also ambiguity about causal directions. And then alternative quality criteria related specifically for qualitative approaches. And here we have dependability. So please note that when we have quantitative criteria, it's easier to kind of make an analysis and try to be very strict about, well, the researcher did this, the participant were exposed to this. So you can have some good ideas about reliability and validity. But when it comes to interviews, it can be really difficult to evaluate those. And therefore we have, for evaluating more qualitative research, these criteria here, dependability. And it says this is the parallel criterion to reliability. So dependability is about recording all of the changes to produce a reliable, dependable account of the emerging research focus that may be understood and evaluated by others. So it's about recording, it's about documenting. So it is really important that we can document and make sure that we have recorded everything, because that means we can go back and say, okay, this is how it was done. Okay, then we can depend on it. Then credibility, it's parallel to internal validity. So it's about ensuring that the representation of the research participants' socially constructed realities actually match what the participants intended. So we need to make sure that what we have asked the participants to participate in is also what they are participating in. So making sure that the realities are aligned, more to say. And then transferability, it's about providing, as it says here, full description of the research questions, design, context, findings, interpretations, etc. So again, being or having transferability simply means you need to document again and make sure that everything is transparent. and that everybody can access what it is that you have been going through. And then the last thing about here, authenticity criteria. Is not considered as parallel criteria, but a criteria that are specifically designed for the nature of constructivist or interpretivist research. So it's about designing to promote fairness by representing all views of the research, raise awareness and generate learning, and bringing out about change. So authenticity is about, again, making sure that we have transferability, transparency, etc. in the research, so that we can go through what was it that we saw. Example, you would probably need to do some research in companies when you're doing your, maybe not your next semester project, but on your 6th semester and your bachelor thesis, you will do interviews of CEOs in companies, of different kind of people. And therefore, you would have to document everything, because you would need to be able to go back and make sure that everything is okay. And maybe you have overlooked something, and then you would have to be able to document that you didn't overlook, or you did overlook, and then you learned, and then you can move forward with a new knowledge. So that leads us to more or less the end of this lecture here, where we have focused on methodology and strategy, and we have specifically talked about primary and secondary data, qualitative and quantitative, talked about the strategies, and touch upon reliability and validity in this case here. And that ends this part of the lecture.